Our story begins with two former employees of Microsoft, Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington. The two of them were long-term employees of Microsoft, with Newell spending 13 years there, serving as a producer of the Windows 1.0x operating systems. Newell had been rewarded substantially from a financial standpoint due to Microsoft's success and gained insight into how to run a software business. Inspired by the creation of various games at the time, such as Quake by ID Software, Newell and Harrington were inspired to create their own software company. Eventually in 1996, they decided to call the company Valve Corporation LLC. The new company Valve was based in Kirkland, Washington. With money to run the company but no project yet, Valve soon needed to start developing its debut game. Newell once told GameSpot, "3D action games were our favourite genre. We also thought there was a lot of room for improvement." Right from conception, the creators wanted to make a game that would be backed up with a convincing story. The game in view should ideally focus on puzzles and would belong to the FPS genre. Unfortunately, this was a rather strange concept at the time. It had been decided that the game would be horror theme inspired, as Newell had been reading Stephen King's The Mist and had been intrigued by its horror element, hoping Valve's debut game could be based on a similar idea. FPS games at the time, such as Doom and Quake, were also inspired by the horror theme. Now that the desired elements were clear, it became necessary to employ the services of an actual author to create a compelling plot. Consequently, Valve called in horror author Mark Laidlaw and gave him the responsibility of creating an alluring story that could be synchronized with engaging gameplay. Laidlaw in an interview with GameSpot said, "We did not want the story to rely on one character coming and telling you the whole tale at one point, and that was it. We wanted to gradually ease the player into the story and provide little clues along the way." Laidlaw came up with an interesting plot which centered on Gordon Freeman, a MIT theoretical physicist who seeks to survive and close the dimensional rift that has allowed an alien invasion into the Black Mesa research facility. To survive, Freeman must reach Black Mesa's mysterious Lambda complex, where a team of survivors are rumored to have found a way to end the disaster. When choosing a name for the game, Valve tried to establish a criteria. They wanted it to represent the theme and avoid cliches of the genre while being unique in design. Valve hoped to create a mature theme, something beyond the typical shooting gallery that was popular at the time. After some brainstorming, they came to the conclusion that the game would be named Half-Life, with the logo featuring the lowercase Greek letter lambda, which is the physics notation for the decay constant of half-life. With the plot set and a team of developers ready, the making of Half-Life began. Interestingly, Half-Life encountered a peculiar struggle. Most publishers of the time were not ready to finance the game's development. It was believed the unconventional concept of Half-Life was too ambitious, let alone for a company that had not developed a game before. For publishers, it was simply too great of a risk, and none were interested in funding Half-Life. According to Newell, they had approached many publishers about the Half-Life idea, and they all thought it was a game that was impossible to make, and were not interested in financing the game. Fortunately, a friend of Newell knew Ken Williams, who was the founder of Sera Online, known today as Sera Entertainment. Coincidentally, Williams had just failed to get the publishing rights to Doom and was keen to make up for that mistake by working on another game that would be just as ambitious. Since Williams knew Newell personally, he believed Valve would be a reliable investment, and Newell was the exact kind of person that could make Half-Life a reality. So he signed for Half-Life on the spot. It was through Sera that Half-Life would become possible. Even with the massive support from Sera at that time, the technicalities involved in developing the game were quite demanding. The development team was not even sure if they can make the characters talk in the way they wanted, as this was proving to be technically impossible at the time. Valve's developers were able to pull through these hurdles after the acquisition of the license for ID Software's Quake engine, an engine that featured true 3D real-time rendering. In little time, Valve had modified the Quake engine, adding features such as advanced AI, until it essentially became a different engine altogether now known as the Gold SRC engine. In facing the new development process, they took a novel approach of assigning a small team to create a prototype level that would contain every element wanted in the final game, and then spent a month repeatedly going through the level. This way, they could decide which element to include or remove in the final version. Publisher Sierra had previously planned for the game to be released in 1997, but this had become infeasible, so a new release date was announced. Valve's developers had to put in great efforts if they were to ever meet this new deadline. By June of 1998, enough had been done so that Half-Life could be demonstrated at the Electronic Entertainment Expo, known by most of us today as E3, the world's first exhibition event for computer and video games. At E3, Valve demonstrated the game's animations and vastly superior AI compared to other games of the generation. Half-Life was very well received and became the center spotlight for game developers, with everyone in the gaming industry talking about the game. It was so good that it even received a Game of the Show award for the demo. Just when it seemed like Half-Life would make the deadline for release, a remarkable incident occurred which caused the near loss of the entire game. 3 months before the game was to be shipped, the visual source failed and all the game data became corrupt. Valve essentially had to recreate the game based on backup copies of different people's computers. This meant that the team lost the compiled game, including its entire backup, forcing them to gather the compiled game from the pieces that could be found on each other's computers. Bearing such a dreadful incident in mind, it is then quite understandable when in the years to come, Neil revealed that he is more proud of Half-Life's release than any award the game received. With regards to the release, Neil told Trepidation Software, "Shipping is something we are very proud of. There is a lot to be said about actually getting a game finished and out of the door with the features you promised and with a high degree of quality. A lot of game companies do not seem to be able to do that right." Following its release on November of 1998, Half-Life won more than 50 Game of the Year awards, received an incredible reception, and ultimately set the Guinness World Record for the best-selling FPS game of all time. It was clear that Half-Life had set a pace for the upcoming games of the genre, a trend that would be followed for decades to come. With its release, the founders of Valve had proved that their debut game was not just an ambitious project, but one that could and would change gaming history. Interestingly, it was at this time that Mike Harrington, the co-founder of Valve, dissolved his partnership with Newell and left the company to take an extended holiday which lasted 8 years. Even amidst the praise Half-Life received, Gabe Newell did not express excitement regarding its success. He described the game that brought him to limelight in a bittersweet way. "The issue with Half-Life for me is that I was involved in a much higher percentage of the decisions about the game, so it is hard for me to look at them as anything other than a series of things I regret." Regardless of Newell's personal feelings towards Half-Life, the success of the first series at the 1998 E3 convention was undeniable. I think most would agree that to this end, Half-Life has lived up to expectation.